Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science, where we explore the questions that connect biology, behavior, and the future of human health. I'm your host Jitendra, and today we ask, what is the metabolic truth? Our guest is Herman Pontzer, evolutionary anthropologist and professor at Duke University, and author of Burn, The Misunderstood Science of Metabolism. His research with Hadza hunter-gatherers redefines what we know about calories, energy use, and the hidden logic behind our body's daily budgets. In this conversation, we explore why two people can eat, train, and sleep the same way, yet see completely different results, how our bodies constantly recalibrate energy use through the principle of constrained energy expenditure. We challenge the myths of BMI, the idea of calories in, calories out, and the notion that health has a single standard. We look at how evolution shaped our bodies to adapt, whether in Arctic cold, tropical heat, or modern office life. As Herman reminds us, metabolism isn't a simple engine to fix. It's an ecosystem learning to balance itself. This is Reason with Science. Let's begin. Hi, Herman. Welcome to the podcast.
That's great to be here.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with how does a day look like for an anthropologist working on metabolism?
Yeah, so the kind of anthropology I do is situated in the natural sciences, right? It's basically human biology, and so I run a laboratory where we measure human energy metabolism, for example. So people might come into the lab and measure a resting metabolic rate or an activity metabolic rate, like walking or running. We've got a great team of postdocs and PhD students and undergraduates here at Duke that work in our lab. And then so sometimes it's lab work, sometimes of course it's writing grants or writing papers, sometimes it's teaching. So I teach physiology and I teach an introduction to human evolution class, typically, and some others too, but those are the ones I often do. And then, sometimes depending on the time of year, like the summer's coming up, so it's fieldwork season. So people from our lab and sometimes me will be out in the field working with communities all around the world to understand how sort of lifestyle diversity affects metabolism, affects the way our bodies work.
And what are the different communities you are studying?
Yeah, so I should say, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist. I'm interested in how our bodies sort of evolved and the way that our physiology works in the kind of lifestyles in which we evolved. And so, we can't go back in time, right? No population today is a time machine or anything like that. But there are populations that are still very physically active, that are still, working to get their own food every day, either with, farming or with pastoralism in their herds, or sometimes hunting and gathering. And so those communities are really important for our kind of work because they let us ask the question, well, okay, if you have this kind of a lifestyle, how does that affect the body? And so we work in northern Tanzania with a hunter-gatherer group called the Hadza. We work in northern Kenya with a pastoralist group called the Daasanach. We've done collaborations with subsistence farmers and hunter-gatherers in South America. So it depends on the question and the grant and the year, but we've been a couple different places.
Yeah, and because it's also quite interesting the way the human or the way our species is diverse, right? But you have like sort of a term for humans, which is miraculous protein robots, right? So
Yeah.
what does that mean? And so yeah, and what's your sort of understanding? Why sort of protein robots, right?
Yeah, so I wrote this book, Adaptable, which I'm excited to talk with you about. Yeah. And I wanted to call the book Protein Robot. And the publisher said, nah, I don't know if people will understand what you mean by that. And that's fair because it's a strange thing to call a person. But I like it because I think what it gets at is it is a way of thinking about our bodies as, as machines, basically, right? Where we are made from different parts that all work together, like any machine does, like your car or your computer. And the difference is that our parts are made of proteins. And so we are protein robots. We don't think of ourselves that way. And of course, humans are more than just our parts, of course. But it is true nonetheless that all of our parts work together in these interesting ways. Each part has a story, right? So I think, we think about, well, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but we think about human diversity as being kind of these big broad brush. Oh, you're Asian. Oh, you're black. Oh, you're white. In the States, anyway, we talk about it in sort of these big, broad race-based categories that don't have a lot to do with our actual biology. And what that misses is that every part of you, right, your digestive system, your immune system, your brain, your muscles, it all has its own story. It's all its own piece. And to understand how those pieces come together, I think is one of the great joys of doing the kind of work that I do. And I wanted to share that with everybody. So yeah, protein robots. If it gets people thinking differently about the human body, I think it's good.
Yeah, but even like in this sense, there is like a lot of I would say diversity in the hardware, right? Means it's
Yeah,
not exactly the same. It's not like replica of a thing. There is a sort of difference there, right? So how do
absolutely.
you
Yeah.
look at that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think anthropology is really the study of human diversity and variation, right? Why are we all different? And so I think the way that we come to that, the way that sort of superpower that you get if you train in anthropology is having a really kind of grounded, evidence-based way of thinking about why are we all different, right? And yet also all very much the same, right? How do we hold those two ideas which seem in conflict in our minds at the same time, right? I'm talking to you, we understand each other, we have all the same basic body parts, and yet it is absolutely true, I'm sure, that you and I are also very different. On every little level, we could find differences between our genes, our different parts of our body. And so how do we understand those differences? The way that it often gets talked about, again, are in these big broad brush things. So if I'm in this category, then all of my parts look like that. If I'm a white guy, all my parts look like white guy parts. And if somebody else isn't, then all their parts look like that. And that kind of gets it wrong for a few different reasons. One is that, it kind of says that groups are very different from each other, but within groups, we're very much the same. Um, and that's not really true at all. Actually, there's a lot of variation within groups. That's super interesting, right? Even within my family, like I've got 2 kids and a wife, each of us is different, right? So within this very small group, we're very different. And actually, it's also true that the groups are not different. So if I look at all the genetic variants in my hometown here in North Carolina, and everybody in our population versus your population over in Czech Republic, I'd find that we share a lot of the gene variants. And actually, the groups are not very different. The individuals are different, right? So how do we talk about that? And then there's questions about how genetics and environment come together to make these differences. So there's a whole lot to talk about.
Yeah. But do we need to ask this question that like how can we biologically the same species but still perform all these different functions, right? Do we need to
Yeah.
talk about this?
Oh, I think so. Because, the big questions that we face in society today, um, so many of them come down to how we understand how our bodies work,
Yeah.
and also how our bodies differ, right? And so, for example, questions about racial differences, right? Why is it that in America, people who are Black, Native Americans, other minority groups have worse health outcomes on a lot of measures, or have different educational attainment scores in other measures? Do we understand those differences as being due to environmental effects, genetic effects, right? If we don't get that right, then we will make we'll have very different answers as to how we wanted to try to make those differences better. Male and female differences, right? So the big questions about like transgender women in sports today. It's a huge topic. And fundamentally, it comes down to how do we understand how the bodies work and how male and female bodies are different, and the same for that matter in other ways. You can go on and on. Vaccines, right? That's not really about an issue about personal differences, but that also comes down to an issue about how we think the body works. And so we absolutely need to have a good way to talk about our diversity and how our bodies differ. And if we don't have that, man, we don't really have a good foundation to talk about these really important issues.
Yeah, and it's very also important to kind of understand the implications of it. I mean, it's social, political, but also like
Mm-hmm.
if I visit a doctor and get my just routine checkup, right? Uh, so
Yeah,
so in the report there are some certain values, right? Which is
that's
like
right.
the hemoglobin is this to this, or like etc. etc. And these values are also decided based on like this population level studies, right?
I'll give you a great example. So my mother-in-law, she's Asian. She went in for a standard bone density test. Yeah. And she got her results back, and I was reading the results with her because she asked me to sort of help her interpret them. And I was happy to do that. And at the bottom of the report, it says, here is your 10-year likelihood of a major bone fracture, which that's a scary thing for somebody, anybody, but especially if you're older, right? A major hip fracture, really serious medical event. So that's an important number to know, right? Am I high risk? Am I low risk, et cetera? And they had this algorithm that they linked. You could check out this algorithm to see how they figured it out. And so I went there. Was curious to know. And you put in her bone mineral density scan numbers. So the minerals that they actually scanned with the machine. So the real material properties of the bone. Then you can put in her age and her height and her weight and all those kinds of things. All of that makes good sense. And all of those together, you would think, well, if I know how big you are, how old you are, what your material properties of your bone are, that's a great way to predict your risk of fracture, right? But then on top of that, they have this extra thing you click. Oh, is the person Asian? Are they black? Are they white? And that will totally affect the numbers that it comes out of it, even though that's meaningless, right? So I don't know what sort of training data set they use to sort of get this algorithm trained, right? This is kind of a machine learning or algorithm kind of learning thing, but they must have had race in there in the training set, and it picked up some variation across groups. That's not biological variation, right? They're picking up something in that specific training set they used, however long ago it was and wherever it was, that there was some environmental effect or lifestyle effect that they are calling race. But it, of course, doesn't necessarily apply across everybody who's Asian or anything like that. It's got nothing to do with the biology of the person. And yet it's misunderstanding how our bodies work fundamentally. And the doctor is using that number to determine if this, in this case, if my mother-in-law is high risk for fractures. So there are all kinds of examples of that, to your point, and if you are armed with a better understanding about how your body works, when you talk to the doctor, you're going to be better informed about how to sort of understand your own health for sure.
Yeah, and your insights, they come, a lot of insights, they come from Hadza hunter-gatherers, right? Um,
Yeah.
so what do you sort of observe when it comes to, let's say, simply metabolism, right? Comparing yourself and let's say someone from their community.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, if people don't know the Hadza community are these. It's a traditional hunting and gathering community in northern Tanzania. So they live in the savannah, in grass houses, in these small camps, and women spend every day going out to get plant foods to eat. They gather plant foods. Men go out to hunt with bow and arrow, wild game. They also collect honey. They don't have any guns or cars or electricity, or anything like that. It's a very traditional hunting and gathering lifestyle. And because of that way they live their life, they're incredibly physically active. Yeah. So men get like 19,000 steps a day on average. Women get 13,000 steps a day on average. And then on top of that, they're doing all this other work, just literally to make a living, to go get food for the day. Okay. So about 15 years ago now, with Brian Wood and Dave Reichland, I went to work with a Hadza to try to understand how many calories that you burn every day if you have that kind of active lifestyle. Yeah. And it seemed like an important data point because nobody had ever measured energy expenditures in a hunting and gathering group before. And of course, humans, that's the lifestyle that we evolved in. So if that's our normal lifestyle and that's how many calories you should be burning, then we need to know that number, right, to sort of understand our metabolism today and how it might be different. And so we went to the northern Tanzania. We worked with the Hadza for a summer. and use this state-of-the-art technique to measure total daily energy expenditure, all the calories you burn every day. And we measure for about 10 days in each subject, each participant, adult men and women. And we get the numbers back after this whole field season and all this work to do this. And it turns out they have the same daily energy expenditures. They're burning the same number of calories every day as folks in the US and in Europe and all these other industrialized sedentary populations. It was a total shock, actually. And I think that's when my real love of understanding human diversity was sparked, right? I mean, I'd always been interested, but I was like, oh, okay, we got a lot to learn from all these other cultures, and so let's do more of this.
Yeah. Yeah, let's discuss more about the controversial stuff, right? I mean,
Yeah,
we
sure.
need to, right? I mean, it's the age of media where controversy is the news.
Yeah.
Whenever, so, but jokes apart, the major thing is that so first of all, how do you measure the total energy consumption?
Yeah.
That's
So
the
we
important thing.
yeah we use a technique called the doubly labeled water technique. Folks can check it out online if they're interested. But the basic details are that you drink about that much water,
Mm-hmm.
and but some of the hydrogens are deuterium, a different isotope, a different form of hydrogen. Some of the oxygens are oxygen 18, a different form of oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
And so you drink those rare isotopes into your body. They're safe. They're not radioactive or anything like that. They're totally safe and stable. But we can use them like tracers to trace hydrogen and oxygen flowing through your body. The hydrogen isotopes you flush out as water. So urine or sweat or water vapor that you breathe out, the water is lost that way, and the hydrogen isotopes are lost that way. So if we measure you, we get a urine sample right after we give you the dose, or a couple hours afterwards. So after it goes into dilution in your body, we'll see that the amount of that isotope rate, the hydrogen isotope is quite high because we've dosed you, and so it's higher than usual. But then over the next few days, if I get urine samples every couple of days, I'll see you're flushing that out, and it's going down, down, down. The rate you're losing that hydrogen isotope. Okay, it's the same story for the oxygen isotope. You lose it with the H2O that you lose, but you also, the way your body handles carbon dioxide in your blood, when you breathe carbon dioxide out, you also can lose the O's that way. That oxygen isotope can also be lost as the CO2 that you exhale. And so if I compare how fast I'm losing the hydrogens to how fast I'm losing the oxygens, the difference in those rates tells me how much carbon dioxide my body is making. And that tells me how many calories I'm burning. Because I can't make CO2 without burning calories. I can't burn calories without making CO2. So it's an accurate physiological measure of energy expended every day. And it's the gold standard technique. It's really the only way to do it, to measure total calories burned every day, for people who are sort of outside of a laboratory setting and live in their normal daily life.
I mean, it's crazy to think about that, you're sort of sitting in this room, the sedentary lifestyle, the
Yeah.
so-called sedentary lifestyle has the same
Yeah.
energy consumption as someone who is sort of moving a lot and stuff, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was a total shock, I have to say. And I, you know, the first thing we assumed was that we'd gotten it wrong, right? Because that didn't seem to make sense. And so we checked with our, at the time we were doing all these analyses with a lab at Baylor University. Bill Wong, one of the world leader in this technique. And he said, no, the data all look really good. We had heart rate recordings. People who were in that study also wore a heart rate monitor every day. And we had that calibrated against a mask-based respirometry system. So we knew we could also kind of calculate it that way to get their calories per day. And sure enough, get the same answer. And then what's really important is we've replicated that study in different populations. And so we've done another study in northern Kenya with a group called the Daasanach. Same story. We've done work with the Tsimane and the Shuar populations in South America that are subsistence hunter-gatherers and farmers. Same story. So, we see this again and again and again, and it's, total shock. But there you have it. That's the data. That's the beauty of science, right? Is when you get surprised.
I always measure my sort of steps and energy consumption during the
Mhm.
exercise using like Apple Watch or something, and I'm sure like a lot of people they are using these monitors, right?
Yeah.
But I think none of them counts the resting energy, right? If I'm correct.
Yeah, if they tell you what your resting energy is, it's guessing.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a total estimate based on, if you on your app you put in your age and your weight and all that kind of stuff, it'll take those data and it'll estimate a resting energy expenditure, I suppose. So, but yeah, it isn't actually measuring that.
Yeah. Because yeah, I mean the other thing is that how much sort of in this sense how much energy we are spending, or like what are those activities which are sort of
Yeah.
increasing this basal metabolic rate.
Yeah, well, so you're a protein robot and you've got all these different parts and every part uses energy, right? And so brains and your liver and your immune system and everything. It's all using energy all day. And so what we think is happening, and I should say this is where we get into work is still ongoing. So if you're listening to this and thinking, well, where does the body save that energy? We don't, we have some circumstantial evidence about what we think is happening, but we haven't nailed it yet. So we're still working on this. But yeah, if we look at, so for what we think is happening is your body is reducing energy expenditures in these other systems, right? So if your body uses more energy with its muscles and exercise, it'll use less energy in other systems. And so if we look at athletes, for example, athletes have fewer white blood cells, they have lower rates of inflammation, their immune system is less active, right? Okay, they're saving energy that way. If you look at people who exercise a lot, they produce fewer stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, right? And those are hormones that increase your metabolic rate. So they do less of that, and that's another way to save energy. If you look at people who exercise all the time, they have lower levels of sex hormones. Like if it's a woman, it'll be lower levels of estrogen and progesterone. If it's men, males will have lower levels of testosterone. And that's, again, those hormones, estrogen and testosterone, those are hormones that amplify your cell activity, right? So if you have less of that, we think it's okay, you're probably saving energy that way. So we're still trying to understand. It's very hard to measure energy expenditures of particular parts of the body. That's a very hard challenge. And so we're still working on that. We're making some headway, but that's right now, that's what we think is happening.
Because this is where I wanted to go, right? Like in general, it's considered that the muscles are sort of quite energy intensive, that they
Mm-hmm.
or they take in a lot of calories, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but the same thing brain does. So and is there sort of a study to where they compared muscle cells and then neurons and or in general like the consumption of the brain versus sort of muscle kind of a study?
Yeah, they've done that. So for example, I think this is in the 70s or the 80s, they
Uh-huh.
would, for example, monitor the blood supply to the brain and
Mm-hmm.
then monitor the blood coming out of the brain. And
Mm-hmm.
they would see how much oxygen is in the blood going in, how
Mm-hmm.
much oxygen is in the blood coming out, and they could calculate the difference and figure out how much oxygen the brain used.
Mm-hmm.
And they could do that for all of your organs. And they've done that for humans and a few other animals. Back in again, this is 40 or 50 years ago now, this work was done, I think. The problem is that work was done sort of just as a one-time measurement for the human value for these organs, right? So we know, roughly speaking, for example, we know that the human brain burns about 300 kilocalories a day every day. That's the equivalent of running a 5K.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we don't know if it's a little bit higher or a little bit lower, depending on different factors. I suspect the brain is pretty protected, and the brain doesn't change very much. That's my guess. Your body would, if your body is smart, and it's an evolved, system. It should protect the most important things the most. So we would expect that the brain probably doesn't vary that much with exercise. But things like, again, when we see differences in immune function, we see differences in sex hormones, we see differences in stress reactivity. that tells me or suggests to me that the body is able to reduce energy costs in those different tissues. But we don't have those kind of measurements. Let's look at you before you exercise and then after you exercise, or after you've been exercising for a few months, and see if we can measure the tissue differences. We'd love to do that.
Yeah, and I think there is also something like, if there are exercises which are intensive, right? Like, it could be physically, but I think there could be also sort of more intensive exercises for brain, right?
Mm,
Where if we are solving calculus, I don't know, for 6 hours, right?
yeah.
Compared to watching Netflix for 6 hours. So if this has any effect on the calorie intake.
It could brain. So that people have looked at that. They've tried to get metabolic rates to change with a mental challenge. And so the typical test is you have somebody play chess
Mm-hmm.
against a computer,
Mm-hmm.
and you can change the computer settings so it's very hard for the person to do it. However good they are, you can make it a little bit better than them. And so they're playing against this opponent that is really making it hard for them. And when you do that, the brain, the increase in energy expenditure from the brain is not particularly high. It's only a few calories an hour. It's not that impressive. Um, but you're right that when you do something stressful, mentally stressful, you do feel exhausted at the end of that, right? If you remember, I think back to my college days, you cram for an exam, you take the exam, you're working so hard, and you walk out of there just exhausted. It turns out that exhaustion isn't so much about the brain exactly. It's about all those stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, right? That are you are probably burning more calories throughout the body because it's this big stress response, and it's not so much about the neurons doing more work.
So then the major factor is stress. If
In
we,
that case, yeah, in a testing case, yeah, that's probably the biggest reason people feel so tired after a big test.
but it could be also in the case of, let's say, over exercising and stuff, right? How
Oh,
does that affects the relationship of body with metabolism?
yeah, that's right. So when we start thinking about exercise as not just sort of adding calories on to what I need every day, but it starts to sort of change the way the body is burning those calories across systems, and there's these trade-offs. Okay, well, that actually helps explain, like you're saying, the overtraining thing. So athletes who train too much, what happens? They don't heal from injuries. They get a cold and they get sick and they can't recover. Women will stop getting their period. They'll stop cycling. Men will have also like lower libido and lower, testosterone levels. What's going on? Well, I think of that as just the extreme case of the normal rejuggling that happens when you exercise. So, most of us, if we go out and exercise, we try to exercise every week. That's a good thing. It takes some energy away from systems that don't need so much energy. So it reduces inflammation, that kind of thing. But if you go too far, if you exercise too much, there's no more of the budget to cut without causing trouble. And so the body's cutting into these systems that you actually really need to have online. And that's overtraining syndrome. So it's a sort of extreme case of something that happens to all of us whenever we exercise.
In general, there is a notion, right, that calories in, calories out.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is that the calories out part is more restricted in this sense, or it's more sort of limited.
Yeah, it's hard to budge, hard to change, right? And so I think calories in, calories out, I mean, it's absolutely correct because the laws of physics apply to everything, including us.
Mhm.
But if you think, okay, well, calories in, calories out, so I'm going to change my calories out by starting this exercise program.
Mm.
Yeah, great. For a while, the math will work. If you add 200 kilocalories of exercise every day, that's right, you run 2 miles a day, 200 calories a day, you'll see that change in how many calories you burn every day for a while. And then what will happen is over time, your resting metabolic rate will adjust. And so 6 months later, 8 months later, even though you're doing the same exercise, and even though the exercise itself still costs 200 kilocalories a day, right? Your running has not gotten cheaper for you. Everything else has changed around it so that the impact on the total calories burned is not 200 calories a day anymore. Now it's less. Maybe it's only half of that. Maybe it's even back to where you started before, you started the exercise program. We see some variability in that response, but people tend to be burning less. The body's making is juggling. Yeah. So calories out, calories in. Yeah, it still works. It's still true. But now you have a really hard time tracking your calories out because you thought you understood it and you thought you had, but the body was messing around with you.
And how about the shocks to the system? Because I mean, of course, we are talking about exercise, but exercise could be anything. Of course, in two major ways, we can say cardio or weightlifting, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah.
But then the point being, if we just like try different shocks to the system and like mix cardio with weightlifting, then how that would change.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We don't have good data on that where people sort of mix and match different exercise routines. People do that, of course, but we don't have lots of good studies on that. But I will say that when you look at exercise intervention studies, it seems that that weightlifting has less of this compensation happening. So if you are resistance training, that seems like a better way to avoid this than just cardio.
Yeah, so we were talking about the calories in, calories out, and different
Right.
exercises, right?
Yeah. So if you resistance training seems to be less resistance training, weightlifting seems to lead to less of that kind of energy compensation. I say that because we're currently doing a review of all the studies we could find that have good measurements before and after an exercise intervention. And so at least the preliminary look at those data, don't quote me quite yet, but the preliminary look at those data look like if you're resistance training, maybe you have less of this compensation happening, which is interesting.
And what about the other kind of shocks? I mean, we could talk about cold therapy, right? Swimming, for example. Uh, so is there sort of also some data on the?
I don't know of any cold therapy. So if you're cold all the time,
Mhm.
you'll burn more energy. Your body has all these mechanisms to try to stay warm. There's a great study that just came out a couple of years ago looking at people who live in Siberia. They're a pastoralist group, very traditional group. They live with their herds of animals, and they ride horses a lot. I think it's like a very, very traditional lifestyle, as I understand it. The group is called the Tuvan. And they did the kind of measurements that we did with the Hadza or the Daasanach. They did those same kind of measurements with this population in the middle of winter. It was so cold that at nighttime it was below freezing inside their houses. Right? It was so cold, and so not surprisingly, they had higher metabolic rates for the week or whatever that they were measured because their bodies are, their bodies are trying to stay warm. So yeah, if you want to live like that, that'd be a great way to try to boost your metabolism. But it'd be hard to do, I think. Here in North Carolina, I wouldn't be able to do it now. It's too warm. Maybe for a month in February, I could try to do that if I want to live in shorts and a t-shirt and never put on a jacket and never come inside for that matter.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that do you really need sort of that long time, or that sort of longer exposure, or could it be enough like if you do it for a couple of minutes, for example, right? That's
Yeah, no, that's not going to do anything.
okay.
Yeah, for that minute or 5 minutes, yeah, you might burn more calories because you're cold.
Hmm.
Right? If you shiver, that's your muscles, for example, burning energy to keep you warm. But 5 minutes over the course of, think about energy budgets over the course of days and weeks. It's nothing, man. It's nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because I was thinking, comparing our sort of sedentary lifestyle to hunter gatherers, because in the other case, there is definitely more shock, in a way, like if you're, I don't know, in wild hunting stuff, I can
It's
imagine.
true. Yeah, there's more that comes up every day. Yeah, it's interesting. But I don't know. I mean, I lived in New York for 7 years. There are
Mhm.
plenty of shocks, right?
Yeah. And what about nowadays? Do you-
Uh, Well, nowadays I live in a very kind of comfortable part of North Carolina and, in the woods. So it's pretty chill.
Yeah. And
Excuse me.
are there sort of effects of diets in this case? Because that's also like another important aspect to, how
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. So diet can affect your metabolism in a couple of ways. One is if you go on a really serious crash diet,
Mm-hmm.
eat many fewer calories than you're burning. Excuse me. If you go on a crash diet, eat fewer calories than you're burning a lot, like you're trying to lose lots of weight right away, your body will respond to that by lowering your metabolic rate. It's kind of a starvation response. Your body doesn't want to lose weight, and so um, it'll turn your metabolic rate down to try to minimize the difference between how many calories you're eating versus how many calories you're burning. That's the main way. Whenever you eat a meal, your metabolic rate goes up a little bit to digest the food, for example, so that it affects it that way. Sorry, I'm coughing. But there's no sort of particular diet people eat. If it's a keto diet or a Mediterranean diet or anything like that, or vegetarian, or that reliably changes metabolic rate.
Yeah. So that means like there are also these sort of factors: what we eat, how much we eat,
Yeah.
that would really impact. And what about like the combinations of the other things, right? Like sleep, in general, like what kind of work we do, and does it like, would it really matter if we are working in the field? Like, yeah, I mean, you guys
Yeah.
do the field in general, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty. Your metabolism is pretty robust to that stuff. I will say circadian changes are an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's some data. There's not a lot of work on that specifically, but there's some data that say if you really mess up your circadian kind of rhythm, if you don't sleep regularly, if you don't get enough sleep, people who work night shifts sometimes and they switch to day shifts and they kind of keep on switching back and forth and um, that can really mess up your body in a lot of different ways. It's not good for you. And one of the ways it can change your body is it seems to have some effect on metabolic rate. So I don't think it's well known exactly, but it seems like it lowers your metabolic rate a little bit, perhaps. Um, but I don't think that we know that for sure. But that's the suggestion. In terms of other lifestyle things, I mean, I don't know if a hunter gatherer and a typical American can have the same metabolic rates. I think it's pretty robust to lifestyle, right?
Yeah. I mean, I had like a conversation with John Tregonning, who wrote
Mm,
he's working at Imperial College London, who wrote books, infectious. So he's an immunologist
hmm
and virologist basically, but he also wrote a book on immune system. And the point being that there is sort of the idea is that immune system, or whenever we have infection, the metabolism of course increases, right? Because you have
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, especially if you have a fever or you're really sick, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can.
yeah. So in these scenarios, still we can see the change in metabolism, but once the infection is gone, it would come back to the basal rate that
Yeah,
we had.
we think so. I'll say there might be some exceptions. Some of the people that we work with, some groups that have been measured, have like just chronically high resting metabolic rates. So we did see this, for example, a group called the Tsimane in Bolivia. They farm a bit, they do some hunting, they do some fishing. They live in the rainforest, really, so a really forested, moist, humid environment. A lot of pathogen burden, a lot of parasite burden. And so we see elevated resting metabolic rates with them. So resting, in other words, come in the morning, 7 a.m., 8 a.m., lay on the exam table, just as quiet as anything, and we measure that. And that's elevated compared to other populations. And their total expenditures are a little bit elevated compared to Americans by that same amount. right? So even though they're really physically active, it's not the activity that's changing how many calories they're burning so much. It's the fact that they have a resting that's a bit higher. And so we see that sometimes. If you have a high pathogen burden, there does seem to be some elevation of resting metabolic rate, and perhaps that can kind of push metabolic rates up a tiny bit. But yeah, so that's, I guess that's another way you could live in a freezing cold for a while. That could boost your metabolism. Or if you don't like that, you could get lots of parasites. That could also help you out if you want to boost your metabolism.
Yeah. But still, the major notion about obesity specifically is the major explanation is that it's calories in, calories out are
Yeah,
they are not balanced, right?
that's right. Yeah.
But you are suggesting something else, or what's your sort of understanding about
Oh,
obesity?
yeah. No, I mean, I think it's still calories in, calories out. What I think people get wrong is that there's this idea, and it's you hear it everywhere, so it's understandable that people think this, that you could sort of choose which one you want to change,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, okay, it's calories in, calories out. My weight is at a place that's not healthy, or I want to change my weight. What do I want to do? Well, if you go to any, doctor or any, online CDC, WHO fact sheet, they'll tell you, well, it's diet and exercise, right? Yeah, it's the calories in from your diet and the calories out from your activity. And what we're saying is, well, actually, the calories out, changing that with activity is really hard to do. Yeah. And so it isn't that the calories in, calories out idea is wrong, but what you think you're going to do with exercise is not what you're really going to do. It's not going to really change your calories out very much. And instead, the way to change calories in, calories out for you, if you want to change your weight, is by focusing on diet. That's a much stronger lever to pull, right? A much better tool for weight management than the exercise. So that's what we're saying. I'm not saying that calories in, calories out is wrong. I'm not saying that exercise isn't really good for you. By the way, it's really, really good for you. Exercise is. But if we want to talk about weight, then that really, the focus has to be on diet, because that's 95% of the story is diet.
And does it matter what we eat? Like,
Of course, yeah. If we, well, it matters in some interesting ways. It doesn't matter if you're eating carbs or fats or proteins or whatever. Like, that's people who want you to only eat fats and only, don't eat any carbs, no sugars. That's silly. That you don't need to do that. You can if you want, but there's nothing wrong with eating carbohydrates, for example. But the foods we eat absolutely will affect how we feel and if we're likely to overconsume. So we know that ultra processed foods, for example, right, they seem to trick our brains a bit and push us to overeat. And so, if you have 100 calories of potato chips or 100 calories of broccoli, right, which one are you going to, if you're going to eat the potato chips and you're still hungry and want more potato chips, eat 100 calories of broccoli, you're done. You couldn't possibly eat more broccoli. And so the type of food absolutely matters, but it's for these kind of reward brain system issues, not because carbs are bad or anything like that.
so it's more sort of behavioral rather than physiological in a way.
Yeah, well, your brain is physiological too, right? But
Yeah.
the system. So first of all, we know this for a few different reasons, but this is a study I like to talk about. I think it kind of makes the point. There are hundreds of genes now that have been identified that are related to your likelihood of having obesity. So, everybody has the same list of 20,000 genes, but we don't all have the same versions of those genes. We have different versions depending on who our parents were, what we got dealt. And so we call those variants alleles. If you have particular alleles, there's 900 or so genes that we know if you have this allele, this version versus that one, it's a tiny effect, but added up over 900 some alleles, you're more likely to have obesity or less likely to have obesity. And then you can ask the question, well, where are those genes most active? And the answer is they're most active in your brain, right? So they're not active in your fat tissues, your digestive system, or no. The genes that are most strongly implicated with obesity are active in your brain. The new class of weight loss drugs, the GLP-1s and GIPs, the Mounjaros and and Wegovys and all those things and those Ozempics. I don't have investments in any of them, by the way, just to be real clear. But the reason they work, it seems, is they affect the brain and make you less likely to overconsume. So all the evidence points to the brain as the major organ that controls, this obesity risk for people. And so, the question about obesity and eating too much, and it really is a brain issue. And, the reward system that you have when you eat and your relationship with food, that's the main thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so the point being that as long as someone is completing their nutrient requirement, it doesn't matter what you eat, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, it matters in the sense that if you eat all processed foods,
Yeah.
you might eat too much.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of do you want to have the Mediterranean diet or the Atkins diet or the vegan diet? Yeah, as long as you're getting your nutrients that you need, it's important. But as long as you're doing that, then pick whatever diet you prefer.
Yeah. And I think here, I don't know if there are again studies in this that if you are sort of supplementing your diet with and then how do the supplements affect in general your relationship with with food, right?
Yeah.
Because that'll be also another important aspect to it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think most supplements are just placebos, but it depends on the vitamins are probably pretty good for you. Although the evidence, for example, that's one of those disappointing things. I grew up as a kid. I took vitamins every day. My parents said, take a vitamin.
Yeah.
Little Flintstones vitamins. I don't know if you had Flintstones vitamins in the Czech Republic, but they're little cartoon character vitamins. And as far as we can tell from the epidemiological studies, there's almost no effect of vitamins on health. I'm taking a vitamin every day on health.
I mean, I've seen vitamin D definitely does a lot, especially when I'm doing exercise and stuff. But apart from that, I'm not sure the other vitamins if they have much effect, especially if I get them from the diet.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it's not then all the genes, right? It's not in all the genes, or it's the genes then.
Well, so I think, look, 2 generations ago, our grandparents and great-grandparents, they didn't have an obesity problem, right? I mean, individuals might have, but at the population level, obesity was not as big of an issue as it is now. So, and in 2 generations, the genes have not changed. Yeah. And so we have our grandparents and our great-grandparents' genes, and yet we have a very different environment. And it's that different environment that makes obesity such a problem. I think the important thing about the research that that's getting done now on obesity is asking, well, okay, what is it about the environment? Because there's a million things that are different. So what about it? What is specifically is bad? And right now the focus seems to be pointing towards this issue of ultra processed foods. But I think then the question is, well, exactly why? What is it about an ultra processed food that's bad? And so we're going to keep on learning more and more, which is really fun. But yeah, it's the environment because, again, that's why at a population level we have this issue. But it's also when I walk into a supermarket or somebody else walks into a supermarket, what do they put in their food baskets, right? What are they driven to eat? If they skip a meal, is that a problem? Or are they don't care? Yeah. So your individual relationship with food can be, we think, is driven partly by your genes and the way your brain is wired, right? So it's genes and environment always together. That's every system is like that.
Yeah. So that means we are not going to talk about nature versus nurture kind of thing, right?
No, it's nature and nurture together all the time, right? Yeah. I mean, I think about this with height. Height's a great example of this, right? Yeah. So, okay, height seems boring. Okay. It's just, I mean, it's such a simple measure. You can use it with a measuring tape. It's so simple. And yet, think about it. Height is, we know that there are thousands of genes the different alleles you have contribute to maybe being a little taller or a little bit shorter. They all work together. So it's a classic trait that way. We also know that the environment really matters, right? Because if you have malnutrition, you won't grow very well. You have to have enough food. It has to be the right kind of food to grow properly. And yet, so you can think about like the nature, the genetics of it, and the environment of it. But when you start to think about trying to decide how much is genes and how much is environment, it gets really silly really quick. A gene is a sequence of DNA. It can't make you tall. It can't do anything.
Yeah.
Right? It can't do anything without raw materials to put together. Where do those raw materials come from? Your diet and what you ate. That's your environment. The same way that like food can't make you tall. A hamburger doesn't make you tall. A hamburger just gives your genes the raw material. So the idea that there's sort of a genetic component, an environmental component, we can separate them. It's not a bad way to talk about it, I guess. It helps to sort of understand, but we have to understand it's a fiction, right? We create this sort of fiction to talk about a heuristic. We know that these things are actually, you can't pull them apart. And height's another funny one because it gets completely misunderstood when, if you look at, go back to the 1800s, dawn of the Industrial Revolution, right? You had these kids that were working in these factories. This is in London. And they were short. Why were they short? Well, because they were working too hard, burning all the calories on that. They had really crappy conditions. They probably had lots of pathogen burden. They probably weren't getting enough food, right? And so these kids are short. And what did people think about that? Well, at the time, the people in power said, well, yeah, those working class kids are short because they just don't have very good genes, right? Yeah. They thought it was genetic. Oh, well, what do you do about that? Well, nothing. What's the point? You can't help somebody who has bad genes. That was the thinking at the time. Fast forward to today, and I think it's really turned around. If you go to the doctor's office and you look at, I have got 2 kids, and we would take them to the doctor's office and they would plot their height on a growth chart. And if you are above or below that growth chart, they assume it's because something at home, the environment, right? It's 100% environment. Oh, the kid's falling off their growth chart. You're not feeding them enough. They're going too high. You're feeding them too much. 100% environment. But that's not true either, because it can also be true that kids are genetically a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. So, and we see populations like that. I work with a population in northern Kenya like this. It's just they're genetically, there's more gene variants in that population that make people tall and thin. And for years, people thought that they were malnourished. Charity organizations are working with them trying to get to fix this. You can't fix it. It's genetic. So, the pendulum swings both ways, and both of the extreme versions are wrong. And we have to really understand the system together. So something as simple as height is a really great lens into how we understand our bodies,
Yeah. I mean, it's also interesting that sometimes how we pick up a simple topic and just make it more complex, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Until unless like humans are growing in vacuum, we cannot really just talk about one or the other thing, right?
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, I mean, I had a conversation with Nicholas Christakis. He talks about many examples like people they stranded on specific islands and how did they react when they didn't have food and stuff. So those are like very interesting stories on the topic.
Yeah.
But going back to what we were discussing about nature versus nurture, specifically about genes and alleles, I was surprised that you compared alleles with underwears. In your book. that was quite funny and shocking at the same time.
Yeah, good. Well, I mean, everybody's got them, but they're not all the same.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That was a fun analogy, I think.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But if we so the bottom line being that that of course there is all this going on at the bottom of biology. I mean, there is DNA, RNA, proteins, working, doing all the stuff, right? The DNA is getting modified with with, let's say, these small marks in a way, and still there is like a lot of variation. That means like we cannot really have a sort of a script, and we cannot say that okay, this script is going to or is going to turn into Harman or Jitendra, right? Like
Yeah,
there is like
completely.
so much going on there, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, and from the moment from the moment of fertilization, all the development that happens during gestation, and then as soon as you're born, the world is just flooding in, right? And you've got all these genes that are trying to respond. Um, yeah, I mean, that's what's so fun. I think there's look at identical twins. That's another fun example.
Yeah.
Even identical twins who have the exact same genetics. Don't have the same physiology. If you look at them, and you look at them when they're born, they're quite similar, but they drift apart because even just the little differences, the accidents, the silly things that happen, even if they're in the same household, they drift apart. And by the time they're adults, their bodies are functioning differently often. Um, so it's a great example of how it's not just your genes.
Yeah. And along the same lines, it's also again going back to the topic of weight and obesity, what we were
Mm.
discussing, why BMI doesn't really work, right? Because of
Oh, yeah.
all this variation in a way in the population.
Yeah, that's right. So BMI, you're basically the ratio of your weight to your height. I think it's a reasonable first step,
Mhm.
right? I think if you want to go, if your doctor goes to the doctor, your doctor calculates your BMI and says, "Oh my gosh, your BMI is, let's say, 35." A person with a BMI of 35 is probably carrying too much fat, probably. And so it's a good thing to say, okay, well, let's check this again and see. Because if you are carrying too much body fat, we know, hey man, that's a risk. That's like, it's like any other health risk. You should think about that.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should get rid of BMI necessarily, but I think right now it's treated as like the only thing that matters. Or it's, if you go BMI of 30.1 and a BMI of 29.9, we treat those as two different situations, actually, because the cutoff usually 30 for obesity. Um, but the ratio of fat to lean mass underlying that could be different depending on your genes, depending on the way your exercise, all that kind of stuff.
Because the thing is that if we, let's say, that the current system is not working, the current parameters that we have, they are not the best way to understand about your health. There is
Hmm.
biasness and etc etc, right? But then what is or what are the correct measures to understand health in this sense?
Yeah, well, I think if we want to understand why you're different than me, why your health is different than mine, I think we can basically forget about questions about race. I don't think that's going to help us out at all. Right?
Mhm.
Right now, that's one of the first things that that kind of comes up. I don't think that's helpful. I think environment's where we should focus on. So if you have a different health outcome than me, then we should be asking, okay, well, tell me about home. Tell me
Mhm.
about, diet. Tell me about exercise. Tell me about stress at work. Tell me about, do you feel like you have other stressful things happening to you in your life or other good things? Or, so I think focusing on that kind of individualized lifestyle question is the way to start. I think someday we might get to where we can do useful genetic testing that would also help say, if we're thinking about environment and genetics together, right now we don't have a great way to quickly assess genetics in a way that's useful. It takes too long to assess. You can't do it in a doctor's visit. And the information we get back isn't super useful right now. But someday it might be more useful and we can kind of use those together. Um, and then the third thing I would say is to understand that different systems could work differently. So just because if I know something about your heart health doesn't necessarily mean I know anything about your brain health or about your immune system health, right? These are different systems that work differently.
So, in other words, all of us, we are adaptable adapted to a certain environment, and that's what it matters, right?
Yeah, right. We are Play-Doh, we're clay. You come into the world and you get shaped. And so by the time you show up at the doctor's office, right? Well, all the things that shaped you, we should know all those things. We would like to. And just knowing the color is not very helpful, right? I want to know all the things that shaped everything.
The other thing is like how we can sort of measure the environment, so to say,
Mm,
right? Because we can have these subjective questions, and history is right that humans are not that good in sort of these subjective questions, right? So
yeah,
how do we really
yeah.
measure it? That's also a thing.
I agree, and I don't have, the person who can answer that question is going to. I mean, that you'd win a Nobel Prize. I will say. Um, you know, I, this points to a bigger issue. There's a whole world of genetic studies right now called GWAS studies, right? And so, like UK Biobank and these other big repositories of data, millions of people's worth of data, and they have their genetic code sequenced, and they have some data on the person. And so the genetics of height, for example, have been figured out with these kind of big data sets. Well, that's great. They've also been used to assess things like the genetics behind intelligence or something like that. Well, okay, but it's really hard to measure intelligence. And measuring it across populations and comparing across populations is almost impossible. And so what do? Well, they look at something else. They look at educational attainment, right? How many years did you go to school? Okay, well, that's really a shortcut, isn't it? Because the amount of years you go to school might have nothing to do with how smart you are. It has to do with how much money you have, and did your parents, put you. There's so many things that go into that have nothing to do with intelligence, and we know that, and they know that too, but they just assume that there's this correlation. So anyway, the point, what I'm trying to get at is there's this inherent weakness right now. We've actually gotten really good at measuring genetics, and we can do that easily and quickly at scale. Still not in the doctor's office, but for these large scale studies, we're able to do it at scale. The other side of the coin, you mentioned environment. I'll even say phenotype.
Mhm.
Beyond the very simple phenotypes, the traits that we want to measure, beyond the very simple ones, blood pressures and heights, we have a very hard time doing that. And so the questions we can ask are limited because we simply don't have the data that we'd want to have.
So we need like sort of better ways to do the diagnosis in a way, right?
All of it, yeah. To really assess somebody, measure all the traits we think are important, measure the environmental traits. Um, yeah, it's again, I don't know if anybody could figure out the way to do that at scale and do it well. It would be amazing. I haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, and the other thing is like, because of course we've been talking about, sort of this diversity in humans from health perspective, but then there is
Mhm.
also, where there is also sort of an aspect where biology is in a way politicized, or let's
Really?
say that used to sort of understand. It's, I think, all the people, they are trying to understand better. It's just that we have limited sort of understanding in this sense, especially let's say if we
Yeah.
go to the whole talk about sex and gender, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and this is where like your insights would also help, like, okay, how you look at it, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the big topics of the day, and I think this question about are there male or female differences? Yes, of course there are. How big are they? Well, it depends on what we want to measure, and what are the complexities of that? And I think right now it's so politicized because you have people on one side who say biological sex doesn't matter,
Mm-hmm.
male and females are basically the same, and if you try to split people between male and female, that's you're a bad person. You're doing the wrong thing. And then there's other folks on the other extreme who say there are, male and female are completely discrete categories, and there's no complexity there. Any complexity that you think is there is just made up, and people are just making it up and telling stories and trying to be difficult. And so neither of those is truly correct. Okay. We know from I mean, probably our own common experience, but even if not, hundreds of years of doing biology with people, that the male body and the female body are inherently different in a lot of ways, right? I mean, the obvious anatomical differences, but also, size and strength and endurance. Males often have advantages in all those measures on average. Now, there's a lot of overlap too, right? So there's lots of women who are bigger, taller, faster, stronger than a lot of men, but on average, they're different. And then also at the tail ends of the distribution, so at the strongest, tallest people tend to be males, and and then the tallest, strongest females aren't that, right? So if you look at like the end, look at professional basketball players,
Yeah.
right? Professional women basketball players are tall and fast and strong, but professional male basketball players are taller and faster and stronger in general, right? If we look at marathon runners, it's the same. And so, on the other hand, there are plenty of dimensions where there is no real male-female difference, right? So in competitiveness or intelligence, we don't see differences in things like that. Okay, how do we make sense of that? What do we do with that information? Well, once you understand that the averages, means are different, but there's a lot of overlap, that you really can't ignore that there are some of these differences that happen in male and female development. Well, I think that helps kind of educate us in terms of how we're going to deal with questions about like transgender women in sports,
Yeah.
right? If we say, okay, we're going to open up what has traditionally been a female-only category for sports, and we're going to let males in who are transgender women, right? If we do that, then we are potentially going to have people in there who have a categorical advantage because they went through puberty as males, and testosterone, we know, has these durable effects on being bigger and stronger and faster. So I think there's a fairness question there, Now, of course, there's also the inclusivity question. So we have to decide, does the fairness issue outweigh the inclusivity issue or vice versa? What I think is, I think that's the right conversation to have, right? And we can have it based on the science. I think, again, the one extreme saying that those differences don't exist, so we don't even have to have the conversation, I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's correct. I think the other extreme that says, that gender identity isn't a real thing, for example, that people are male or female, and that's all there is to it. Well, that ignores the fact that we know across cultures and across time, transgender and non-binary people are a part of the population everywhere we look, all over the world, right? So that is a part of the human diversity experience, is that you'll have people who honestly, truly identify like that. So I don't think we can say that they're making it up or something like that. I mean, that's the real lived experience. And so it's a challenge, right? How do we incorporate these things? And I don't know what the answer is, and that the book isn't trying to give you the answer, right? My politics aren't what's important, but I think that we do need to have that conversation starting with the science, right? Because it takes the extremes, I think, out of the picture a little bit, and it puts more emphasis on the middle where we can have this good conversation based on evidence, and it's just hopefully less heated, more thoughtful dialogue across ideas.
Yeah. I think, I mean, a lot has to do with how we want to, how we want people to react in this certain categories, right? Because I mean, of course, gender looks at spectrum of behavior in the people, and on the other hand, sex is like categorical. Like, okay, there are only two categories, and yes. The point is, do you think that the or how far science can go to give an answer, to, because that's also a thing. I mean, if we look at the development of a human sort of embryo, right? A lot of people, as they say, that testes are just descended ovaries in a way, like if we just look at the process. So yeah, the point being, like, how far even science can go to address the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think science can be really clear that, look, we can document and measure. We have done this, not my lab, but lots of people have done this. What is the difference in strength, muscle strength? What's the difference in size? What's the difference in endurance? And you can measure all these things, and you can say, look, in sports, for example, this always comes up in sports. In sports that emphasize these characteristics, yes, there is a male advantage. Absolutely, there is. Now, in sports where that doesn't matter, so for example, shooting sports, archery, right, where you're trying to hit a target, it turns out there really isn't an advantage there for males. And so maybe, the question about fairness versus inclusion, maybe that answer is different in a setting where there isn't this obvious male body advantage, as opposed to a situation where there is a clear male body advantage. And I think the science, the biology of how our bodies work, absolutely helps inform that set of discussions, right? And I don't know where they'll end up, but I think having that information is helpful.
Yeah. And the other sort of view on this topic is gender neutral society, that we don't even care
Mm,
about what a person, it's all of us are humans, we don't
yeah.
care about these norms, right? So what's your view on, or what's your take on this thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I look here. So here's what's is interesting to me. People who want to sort of ignore or erase gender, often, seems to come from a lot of the same people who really want to talk about human diversity and how important it is, right? Um, and I don't understand how you can have it both ways. Our biology, our reproductive biology, is one of the ways that we're diverse, right? Male bodies and female bodies are different in many ways.
Yeah.
And that's part of the diversity that makes us who we are. There's some evidence that, if you have male hormones versus female hormones, it can even affect your brain in the ways, not in intelligence, but in terms of things like aggression, some sorts of preferences, that kind of thing. So it's possible that, and I think our lived experience kind of enforces this idea that, yeah, being male or female, identifying as a man or a woman, your where you are in terms of your gender, that's part of the diversity of what makes people different in good ways, right? That doesn't have to be a bad thing. Now, obviously, if we have, if we're being mean to a class of people, right? Obviously, that's bad. No matter who, if whatever the class is, if it's males or females or women or men or whatever. So, if we're gender neutral in terms of rights and responsibilities, that's fine legally. That's fine. But in terms of ignoring it, oh, I
Mm.
think that's a mistake. I think we should embrace all of these differences. I think this was fun.
Yeah. And the same thing goes with the diversity in general, right?
Yes,
that's sort of again the strength of humans, that we appear so diverse. There are all this sort of diversity, but on the other hand, collectively we have done a lot, right?
that's exactly right. I mean, we're the most successful primate on the planet, maybe by some measure, the most successful animal ever.
Yeah.
No other animals figured out how to go to space. We did that, right? So look, we live everywhere on the planet. How most species um, live in a particular environment. They have to fit that environment. Humans aren't like that, man. We can live anywhere, and we can do that because we're so adaptable, because we have this culture and biology working together. Yeah, I mean, the diversity is the superpower, right? So let's not ignore it. I think we should celebrate it, understand where it comes from, and then you can really enjoy it.
And adaptability is also like a major strength in this sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, your adaptability to your environment, that's the basis for everything, right? That's how you grow up. That's how you fit in. It's how you make the most of things and thrive.
Yeah. And the other sort of take home message would be that a sort of spectrum is normal. It's not really it's not just a number, right? Like it's fine if there is a spectrum in the society.
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so let's sort of conclude. What's next? So in sort of first book, you kind of unified the whole humans and sort of discussed more about the metabolism part. In the second book, you embrace the diversity. What's the third one?
Yeah. Well, the dust hasn't quite settled yet on adaptable, so I'm still kicking some ideas around. I think for the next year or so, it's going to be we've got a couple of really fun research projects that we're trying to get out the door. So we'll be focused on that, and that'll keep me plenty busy. So I don't know what the next book's going to be, but we'll have to see.
Yeah. Well, the two that you have already published, they are quite fun. So people should read it, definitely. And yeah, thank you so much for accepting the invitation. It was fun as well.
Thanks
Thank
for having me. It was really good.